Okay, got that out of the way. I'm done with it. I'm over it. I have exercised my demons. Let's talk about Georgia and Kentucky, a game that you and I thought would be close. I hedged a little bit because I came out saying Kentucky might win it, and then eventually I said they wouldn't. But it turned out pretty much like we thought it would, except two things, and that's what I want you to touch on. First, I was pretty impressed with Kentucky's ability to run the ball against a really good run defense in Georgia. And then I was impressed with Georgia's ability to come back in a game where they had every reason to give up, given the momentum swing in their season and the momentum swing in Kentucky's season. I think they showed a little mettle there. Why don't you take it away and give us some insight on that game?
Right. No, I'm with you. You know, it, the curiosity going into this game was whether or not Georgia was going to get to continue to play with poise, whether they were going to fold a little bit. I mean, they're on a 2-game losing streak that started with Vanderbilt, then looked pretty impotent offensively against Florida. I know Florida's good defense, but still, it's 10 points is. Who's going to win a game just scoring 10 points, right? I mean, that's completely crazy. But yeah, no, Georgia managed to step up, and they put points on the board. They continued to fight, and they managed to beat a Kentucky team that's rising. And like you said, it's pretty. I won't say astonishing, but it's definitely surprising that Kentucky managed to put up a lot of yards against a Georgia defense that's been ranked, top 3, 5 in the conference in rush defense throughout the year, holding teams to under 4 yards a carry. And now Kentucky is really, really kind of standing out. I mean, 6th in the conference, not necessarily the best in the world, but pretty solid rush attack. Actually played a pretty darn good schedule too. They didn't have the highest rushing average in the world with 4.65 per, but they had 40 carries in the ball game. So that's, I think that was a pretty darn impressive performance. And I think you have to give them credit because really outside of the Alabama game and outside of the complete eggs they laid really against Southern Miss and Florida in the first 2 games of the season, they have run the ball for at least 4 yards a carry, between 4 and 8 in every other game this season. So, Kentucky gets a lot of heat for their passing game, which may or may not be deserved. But the run game has been solid, and it's what's allowed them to survive. We talk about this a lot. If you can run the ball, it doesn't matter who you're playing, you're going to be able to stay in the game because you can sustain drives and you're going to have a chance. Passing game will let you beat anybody on any given week, but you can also lose to anybody. But if you can run the ball, you're going to be in every game, even if you're not necessarily going to be winning them.
So running the ball on the other side for Georgia is Sony Michel and Nick Chubb. Are you a little surprised that at this point in the season, it looks like Sony Michel might be, dare I say, the better running back?
Well, I think everybody should be surprised with at least to some degree. You got to question how healthy Chubb really is because he's been banged up all year going in and out of games. He's had lots of lower leg problems. Maybe he's not 100% right. But, I do have a theory on this, and I've had this theory for a long time. If you have a bad offensive line, you want a fast running back and a quick running back. If you have a good offensive line, you want a powerful running back. The reason for that's pretty simple. If your line is bad, you tend to have a lot of disruption behind it on your side of the line of scrimmage, meaning the tailback doesn't get to get a full head of steam and hit the hole. So you want a guy that's fast and quick so he can get around those 300-pound linemen because those guys aren't that fast, right? The way you deal with a 300-pound lineman is you run around him because you're not going to run through him. So if you're struggling a little bit on the offensive line and you got a guy like Sony Michel, you can get the edges, you can get to the second level, you can generate yardage. Conversely, if your line is winning at the line of scrimmage, how do you beat linebackers? How do you beat secondary players? Well, you do it with physicality. You run over them because you should have a size advantage. So you want a bigger back. This year, unlike last year, and we've harped on this a number of times, Georgia's Achilles heel has been offensive line play. Several years now, that was always Rick's problem. Smart inherited a pretty porous offensive line. I know he gets a lot of criticism. I don't think his schedule is warranted considering the talent he has, but you have to accept the fact that their offensive line that he inherited isn't overly good. And what we're kind of seeing is that shift, right? Without as good an offensive line, Nick Chubb doesn't have the room to operate, to get a little momentum, to use his physicality. And it's not that he's really a better back. It's just Sony Michel is able to get out in space well enough to do something. And Nick Chubb just doesn't have that extra little burst or quick step to get in space as needed. And once you get to the second level is really where Kentucky has struggled all year defensively.
I think your point is really well taken, and I had the same impression when just watching this game and watching sort of how they've played throughout the year. It's almost like you can manufacture yards if you have someone that's a little wiggly and got a little bit of a quick step. I don't think Nick Chubb is slow, but he is more of a power back, and I think if you have a somewhat unhealthy Nick Chubb, if he's still a little bit lingering injury world, then it makes it that much more imperative that he has the big holes to run through. So I completely agree with you there. So one more point on this game. Well, a couple of points, but first, Jacob Eason, 17 of 31, 7.9 per with a touchdown. So when Kentucky played Alabama, because that's a pretty good defense, I noticed that Kentucky did a pretty good job against Alabama for probably three quarters. Alabama did have a non-offensive touchdown, and they had a couple of, forced some short fields for their offense. But overall, I thought Kentucky held pretty well. So I think that this is actually one of the games that Eason can build on even more than some of his earlier games where he put up more numbers, more pure numbers. Basically 8 yards an attempt against this defense, I don't think it's terrible, especially since if people stop following Kentucky after the 45-7 loss to Florida, they may not realize that Kentucky is playing pretty good football and very spirited football. So talk about that a little bit in terms of Jacob Eason versus this defense, and in this kind of game where they kind of needed him to be a leader. Just talk about his maturation as a quarterback.
We've discussed all year that Georgia has risen and fallen with Jacob Eason in his arm. We saw it game one when they played North Carolina, that I think it was 4 out of 5 drives that Eason completed a pass, they scored. And every time he didn't, which was, I think, like 9 other drives, they only scored once. So Eason is a key to the team. I know he's erratic. He's erratic because he's a true freshman playing behind a porous offensive line without any real go-to receivers. Godwin's the best they have. He's a high-level talent, but I'm not really sure that he's lived up to the projection. So it gives them balance. I get that. The problem is when you don't have a great offensive line, can't run the ball, makes the passing game harder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you can constantly see the arm talents there. You can see the spark with the way he can deliver the football, the velocity he can put on it especially when his feet are in the right place and what have you. The concern throughout the year, and you see this a lot with quarterbacks that get thrown, especially if they get thrown into a meat grinder as a true freshman, in the middle of the season when they're in the grind and things aren't going their way, they start breaking down in mechanics and the way they deliver the football, the trust in the line, the way they use the pocket, and they stop making reads. They deliver the football too early, too late, and it creates a lot of bad habits. Really, for the quarterback, is what it is, right? If you're used to constantly delivering the ball early, even when you have time, you're going to deliver it early because, as they call it on TV, right, the clock in your head. Conversely, I will push back a little bit and note that this may highlight some sort of hidden issues with Kentucky. Kentucky gave up 8 yards per attempt or more against Southern Miss, against Florida, against New Mexico State, and against Alabama. Where did they really do better? Well, they played South Carolina before Alabama. Then they played Vandy, Mississippi State, and Missouri. Vandy, Mississippi State, they gave up 4.7, 3.9 yards per attempt. Neither one of those teams was throwing the ball well. Mississippi State's come on.
A&M would love
lately.
to have had those kind of numbers against Miss State Saturday. Just saying.
Yeah, but at that time, Mississippi State was not throwing the ball well at all. I mean, I I'm not sure, right? I mean, they kind of cranked down against a couple poor passing teams, and then Missouri was 7.2 per, Georgia 7.9. I'm not sure that's not just what Kentucky's defense is, but still, yeah, you can see improvement with Eason. I don't know. I worry about the kid because I think he has a tremendous amount of potential, but he got thrown in the fire early, and you kind of see him regressing. I think in a lot of ways, frankly, he looks worse than he did at the start of the year. I know I'm not going towards your point here, but I don't know. You can see the spark. You can see what he can be. He could be a high level NFL quarterback, and then I also see flashes where he can go the exact opposite direction. Reminds me a lot of Christian Hackenberg in that way, in that you can see it, but you really start wondering: is the light bulb going to come on, or is it not? And that's going to determine Georgia's fate, I think, the next few years.
So you make a good point because there's this concept in the NFL that it's almost better to be drafted a little bit later so you can be an understudy for a year or two and adjust without the pressure. And you learn just from having that exposure for so long without having to carry the team on your shoulders. Is that something that's kind of at play here where it's almost because of the pressure and because of them riding Eason, he's not getting a natural progression of learning and exposure and maturing where he otherwise would?
I definitely think it's possible, right? I mean, he started the first game of the season with a 185 QB rating. I know he only threw 12 passes against North Carolina. Did pretty well, 147 rating. Nicholls State, Missouri struggled a little bit, but he still had a 114 rating. But it was really that Ole Miss game, right, where they got dominated. Eason had 3.8 yards per attempt, 44% completion percentage. Bounced back against Tennessee. It's really questionable how good their pass defense really was. We found that out when they played Alabama a couple weeks later and A&M the week after that, or the week before, right? Two games in a row where they gave up a lot of points. But then Easton played South Carolina, who, for all their faults, has actually been playing really good defense. Again, 30% completion percentage. Played Vandy, had a good ratings, but he threw a ton of passes, didn't generate hardly any points. Florida, 45% completion percentage. And Kentucky, now we're back to 55. So, I don't know. There's, of the last 6 games, 3 of them were below 50% passing. And, he started off and it was 66, then 55, then 52, then 44. And you could just sort of see him basically collapse there for that 5-game stretch where they dropped 4 games. And what's interesting is the win was the worst percentage of the group. It's just when they were having a hard time, I think it impacted him, and they asked a lot more of him. He's throwing, 36, 40 passes in those games, and it started to establish some bad habits. And then, again, they started being able to run the ball a little bit against Kentucky. He's not feeling like he has to force throws to win a ball game versus, when they only have 10 points against Florida, and he's looked a lot better. But yeah, I mean, it's just crazy, right? I mean, who's gonna win a ball game only scoring 10 points? There's no way that would ever happen.
Well, it's funny. What's a little worrisome for me, if I'm worried about Eason's progression, is it's going to take some time to get both an offensive line around him and the skill players required at wide receiver to where some of the pressure can be off of him and he can excel in a good offense, because I don't care what kind of plays you're drawing up. If you don't have somebody protecting the guy and he doesn't have somebody to throw to, he's not going to put up good numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's we get starting to lead into, I think, probably the last game we discuss on our recaps, which will end up being that Alabama LSU game. As a quarterback, you can produce if everybody around you is great, even if you're not playing well. And even if you are playing well, you can produce nothing if everybody around you is struggling. The quarterback, his production is always a function of the talent around him, and it can be masked, or every flaw can be greatly exposed, because it's just everything the quarterback does, whether he passes it, whether he throws it down the field short, whether he tries to scramble, whether he hands the ball off, all of that requires somebody else to do something at a high level for him to be successful. And that's, running back, only needs a couple pieces, and the quarterback ideally needs all of them operate well for him to look good.
So I think that kind of puts a punctuation on this game. It's really disappointing for me as a fan of SEC football that a lot of people didn't get to see this game because they were watching Alabama and LSU, which we'll get to in a minute. But this was a fun game. It was a really good game to watch. It was a really, you find yourself. They're kind of, at this point in the season, Georgia and Kentucky are kind of both underdogs. So you kind of find yourself pulling for both of them at the same time. It was just interesting, a little bit of back and forth. So I know Kentucky, if they had one fewer turnover, they probably win that game. But live to fight another day.